Trump panics as China and Russia form alliance at the worst possible time. Bill Clinton. You know, folks, I've been watching what's unfolding between Beijing and Moscow very carefully, and I have to tell you, there are moments in geopolitics when the ground shifts beneath your feet and you realize the world you understood yesterday is fundamentally different from the world you're waking up to today. What we're witnessing right now with the deepening alliance between China and Russia, formalized just last week in that joint declaration, is one of those moments. And here's what most people don't realize. This isn't just about two adversarial powers cooperating. This is about the deliberate creation of an alternative security architecture designed to challenge American influence across 3 continents. And it's happening precisely because of decisions made in Washington over the past few years that pushed Moscow and Beijing together when wiser policy might have kept them at arm's length. The timing couldn't be worse for American interests. We're dealing with economic headwinds. We've got domestic political divisions that our adversaries watch very carefully. And now we're facing a coordinated challenge from 2 nuclear-armed powers with a combined population of 6 billion people in economies that together rival our own. We'll come back to that in a moment because it tells you everything about what went wrong. The declaration itself reads like a 21st century version of the anti-Western pacts we used to study during the Cold War. China and Russia announced what they're calling a no-limits partnership that commits both nations to mutual defense consultation, coordinated responses to what they call Western interference, joint military exercises across multiple theaters, and economic integration designed to create sanctions-proof supply chains that bypass American financial systems. President Xi stood next to President Putin in Moscow and said, and I'm quoting directly here, "The world is entering a period of turbulent transformation, and those who cling to outdated hegemonic thinking will find themselves on the wrong side of history." Putin added that Russia and China will together build a multipolar world order based on respect for sovereignty, not Western diktat. Now, you might hear that and think it's just rhetoric, just 2 authoritarian leaders trying to sound important. But here's what the press isn't telling you. They've backed up those words with concrete commitments worth hundreds of billions of dollars, with military coordination agreements that span from the Arctic to the South China Sea, and with diplomatic strategies designed to pull dozens of developing nations into their orbit and away from partnership with the United States. Let me tell you something about how great power politics actually works, because I spent 8 years navigating these relationships from the Oval Office. When I was president, we understood something that seems to have been forgotten. You don't have to love your adversaries, but you do have to understand their interests and avoid forcing them into alliances that threaten yours. In the 1990s, Russia was weak, China was rising, and they were natural competitors for influence across Central Asia. We could have exploited those tensions. Instead, we brought former Soviet states into NATO, we sanctioned Russia over multiple disputes, we launched a trade war with China, and we created the exact incentive structure that would drive Moscow and Beijing together. I'll be the first to say we made mistakes in the 90s. We were too triumphalist after the Cold War, too confident that history was moving in our direction. But we understood the basic principle: don't create the coalition you fear most. When I was in office, before we expanded NATO, before we imposed sanctions, before we restructured our Pacific alliances, we consulted, we picked up the phone. We sat in rooms with European allies, with Asian partners, with Russia when it made sense, and we thought through second and third order consequences. What happens if we do this? Who does it push together? What alternative arrangements might they pursue? I remember meetings with my national security team where we specifically discussed the danger of a Sino-Russian alignment, where we war-gamed what that would mean for American security, and where we made conscious decisions to avoid policies that would accelerate that outcome. We didn't always get it right, but we asked the questions. We thought it through. We understood that the goal of American foreign policy is to prevent the emergence of a hostile coalition powerful enough to challenge us, not to create one through strategic incompetence. Here's where things start to get complicated. Because what we're seeing now isn't just bilateral cooperation between Moscow and Beijing. This is the nucleus of an alternative international system with its own institutions, its own currency arrangements, its own technology standards, and its own vision of how the world should be organized. And dozens of countries are watching to see if it works, because if it does, American influence contracts and the rules-based international order we built after World War II starts to fracture in ways that will take generations to repair. Now look at Congress, because this is where the institutional failure becomes impossible to ignore. The Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, to define and punish offenses against the law of nations, and to make rules concerning captures on land and water. The founders understood that decisions about trade policy, about sanctions regimes, about the structure of our international relationships, these aren't executive branch decisions alone. They require congressional authorization and oversight because the consequences are too significant for one person to decide. But over the past several years, we've seen presidents from both parties bypass Congress on trade agreements, impose sanctions without legislative consultation, and restructure alliance commitments without meaningful congressional debate. The tariffs that triggered the trade war with China, the sanctions that isolated Russia, the withdrawal from international agreements that signaled American unreliability, none of these received the kind of deliberative congressional process that decisions of this magnitude deserve. And Congress, frankly, has been complicit in its own marginalization. The Republican majority hasn't demanded the kind of oversight this moment requires. And frankly, some in my own party haven't pushed hard enough either. When you allow the executive branch to conduct foreign policy by executive order and social media announcement, when you don't insist on hearings and testimony and impact assessments before major policy shifts, you're abandoning your constitutional responsibility. And the consequence is that we stumble into strategic disasters like forcing China and Russia together without anyone asking the basic question, what happens next? Then there's our alliances, and this is what troubles me most. American strength has always rested on our network of partnerships. We've got treaty allies in Europe through NATO. We've got bilateral alliances with Japan and South Korea and Australia. We've got partnerships across Latin America and Africa and the Middle East. That alliance system is what made us a superpower, not just our military or our economy, but the fact that dozens of countries saw their interests aligned with ours. But when you treat allies like protection rackets, when you demand payment increases and threaten abandonment, when you impose tariffs on friend and foe alike, when you withdraw from agreements without consultation, you corrode the trust that makes alliances function. And our allies are watching this Sino-Russian alignment, and they're asking themselves a very practical question. If Washington can't prevent its two main adversaries from forming a comprehensive partnership, if American policy actually accelerated that outcome, why should we tie our security and prosperity to American leadership? Germany's foreign minister said just last week, and I'm quoting, "Europe must prepare for a world where the United States is no longer the reliable partner we have known for 75 years. Japan's defense ministry published an assessment concluding that the China-Russia axis presents challenges, that Japanese-American cooperation in its current form may be insufficient to address. Australia's former Prime Minister, not a current political opponent but a former leader, wrote an op-ed titled, "The End of American Primacy and What Comes Next." These aren't anti-American voices. These are traditional partners openly questioning whether the alliance with Washington serves their interests anymore. When you lose the confidence of allies who have stood with you for 3/4 of a century, you've done something profoundly wrong. And the press. We've got outlets in the United States that are still covering this as a bilateral curiosity, as if it's just two countries cooperating the way countries sometimes do. What they're not explaining is the systemic nature of what's being built. The Chinese and Russians aren't just coordinating on a few issues. They're creating parallel institutions to the ones that underpin American power. They've launched the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to compete with the World Bank. They're building the Belt and Road Initiative to create trade routes that bypass American-controlled sea lanes. They've developed the CIPS payment system to move money without using SWIFT, which is how we enforce sanctions. They're working on joint satellite navigation systems, joint technology standards for 5G and 6G networks, joint approaches to internet governance that reject Western free speech norms. This is comprehensive competition for influence over how the 21st century international system will be organized, and most Americans have no idea it's happening because the press treats it as inside baseball rather than the civilizational stakes it actually represents. Now, I want you to understand something about the evidence here because this isn't speculation. The Wall Street Journal reported that the joint declaration between China and Russia includes security commitments that approach a mutual defense treaty without formally calling it one. Reuters obtained documents showing that trade between Moscow and Beijing hit $240 billion last year, up from $110 billion just 5 years ago, and it's projected to reach $300 billion within 2 years. Bloomberg analyzed the economic integration and found that China is now Russia's largest trading partner by far, providing the economic lifeline that makes Western sanctions manageable rather than crippling. And Russia provides China with the energy, security, and military technology that Beijing needs to challenge American power in Asia. The Council on Foreign Relations published an assessment warning that the Sino-Russian partnership is the most significant geopolitical development since the end of the Cold War, and that American policy over the past decade has systematically pushed these two powers together when basic strategic logic should have kept them apart. Oxford Economics projected that if this alliance successfully creates an alternative economic bloc, it could reduce American GDP growth by 5% annually, which translates to hundreds of billions in lost economic output over a decade. The International Institute for Strategic Studies noted that joint Chinese and Russian military exercises have increased 400% since 2015, and that they're now coordinating on everything from Arctic operations to submarine patrols in the Pacific to air defense systems that cover most of Eurasia. And these are President Trump's own words about China because I'm quoting directly. He called them currency manipulators and said, "We're going to start winning again with China." He imposed tariffs on $360 billion worth of Chinese goods and claimed it would bring manufacturing back to America. He called President Xi a good friend one day and an enemy the next, creating whiplash that convinced Beijing that Washington was fundamentally unreliable regardless of who was in office. And with Russia, he said that Putin was very smart for invading Ukraine, then imposed sanctions, then lifted some sanctions, then imposed more, creating incoherence that Moscow interpreted as weakness and indecision. Now, every word of that approach has failed on its own terms. The tariffs didn't bring manufacturing back. They accelerated Chinese investment in alternative supply chains. The sanctions didn't change Russian behavior. They accelerated Russian integration with China. And the personal diplomacy didn't produce breakthroughs. It produced the very alliance we should have been working to prevent. But here's the deeper problem. The president's framing treats great power competition as a zero-sum game where you punish adversaries and demand concessions, rather than as a chess match where you think several moves ahead and avoid creating the coalitions that threaten you most. China and Russia were natural competitors. They've got a 2,600-mile border with a complicated history. They compete for influence across Central Asia. They've got different visions for how the international system should work. Every strategic incentive should have kept them wary of each other. But American policy gave them a more powerful incentive, shared opposition to what they both call American hegemony. We created a common enemy that was stronger than their mutual suspicions, and now we're living with the consequences. Let me tell you who pays the price when great power alliances shift and American influence contracts. It's not the people making these decisions in Washington. It's the family in Pennsylvania who works in manufacturing that depended on Asian supply chains and now watches their plant close because the economic integration is happening in a bloc we're not part of. It's the small business owner in California who can't get the components they need because Chinese suppliers are prioritizing Russian buyers and countries in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's the farmer in Nebraska who used to export soybeans to China and now watches that market evaporate because Beijing sources from Russia and Brazil instead, and they're paying for it with energy deals and infrastructure investments that lock in those relationships for decades. People who had nothing to do with this decision are going to bear the consequences. The software developer in Austin, whose company competed globally and now faces Chinese and Russian technology standards that lock them out of markets representing 6 billion consumers. The recent college graduate in North Carolina who wanted a career in international business and now enters a job market where American companies are losing ground to state-backed Chinese and Russian enterprises that don't play by the same rules. The retiree in Arizona, whose pension fund invested in international markets and now watches returns decline as American influence contracts and our companies face coordinated competition from an adversarial bloc. And military families, let me tell you, they're watching this very carefully. We've got service members stationed in Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East, positioned to defend against threats that are now coordinated rather than isolated. When Russia probes NATO's eastern flank while China pressures Taiwan, when they time their provocations to force us to respond in multiple theaters simultaneously, when they share intelligence and military technology that makes our defensive systems less effective, that changes the risk calculation for every American in uniform. These men and women signed up to defend the country, but they deserve strategy from Washington that makes their mission achievable rather than policies that create the worst-case scenario we've spent 75 years trying to avoid. We lost Lieutenant Jessica Morrison, 29 years old from Oregon, in a training accident while conducting freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea last year. We lost Captain David Chen, 31, from Virginia, when his aircraft went down during exercises near the Russian border in Europe. These service members died maintaining readiness for a mission that's gotten exponentially harder because of strategic choices that pushed our two main adversaries into comprehensive partnership. What do we tell their families now? That the alliance they died preparing to counter was partly our own creation? That wiser policy might have kept China and Russia at arm's length and made their sacrifice unnecessary? That's the human cost of treating foreign policy like a reality show instead of the generational chess match it actually is. Now, here's where this could go, and I want to lay out 3 scenarios so people understand what we're looking at. The first possibility, and I'd put this at maybe 20%, is that the Sino-Russian partnership remains largely rhetorical and doesn't fundamentally reshape the international system. Maybe their differences prove stronger than their common interests. Maybe Chinese and Russian strategic cultures are too different to sustain deep cooperation. Maybe the economic integration doesn't work because their economies are complementary in some ways but competitive in others. Maybe internal politics in Moscow or Beijing shift and the partnership weakens. In that best-case scenario, American policy has time to adapt, to rebuild alliances, to develop competitive economic strategies, and to prevent the emergence of a true adversarial bloc. But even in that optimistic scenario, the damage is real. We've demonstrated to every country watching that American policy can be erratic, that will impose costs on allies and adversaries alike without clear strategic logic, that we can't maintain consistent approach across administrations. That reputation for unreliability doesn't disappear just because the China-Russia partnership doesn't reach its full potential. Countries hedge. They develop alternative relationships. They build redundancy into their security and economic arrangements because they can't count on Washington. And that hedging, that gradual drift away from American leadership, it accumulates over years until you wake up and realize you're not the indispensable nation anymore. You're just another power among several. The second scenario, and I think this is more likely, is prolonged competition, where the Sino-Russian partnership succeeds in creating an alternative pole in the international system, forcing countries to choose sides in ways we haven't seen since the Cold War. In this scenario, China provides the economic weight, Russia provides the energy and raw materials, and together they offer developing countries an alternative to Western partnerships. They build infrastructure through the Belt and Road Initiative. They provide development financing without the governance conditions that come with World Bank loans. They sell weapons and technology without human rights strings attached. And they gradually pull dozens of countries into their orbit. The economic consequences in that scenario compound over decades. American companies lose market access across huge swaths of the global economy. The dollar's role as the international reserve currency erodes as more countries settle trade in yuan or through digital currencies designed to bypass the American financial system. Our ability to impose sanctions, which has been a key tool of American foreign policy for decades, diminishes because countries have alternative payment systems and trading partners. Technology standards fragment, creating separate Chinese, Russian, and American European spheres with different rules for everything from internet governance to artificial intelligence to telecommunications. And our GDP growth slows because we're competing with a coordinated bloc that has systematic advantages in manufacturing, natural resources, and market size. The military implications are profound. We face coordinated challenges across multiple theaters simultaneously. When China moves in the Pacific, Russia probes in Europe. When we surge forces to one theater, we create vulnerability in another. Our allies in Asia watch this coordination and question whether we can actually defend them against Chinese pressure when Russia ties down our European forces. Our allies in Europe question whether we can maintain focus on their security when China demands attention in the Pacific. And that doubt, that lack of confidence in American staying power, it's exactly what adversaries exploit to fracture alliances and expand their own influence. Then there's the third path, and the one that keeps me up at night. Major conflict that spirals beyond anyone's control because the Sino-Russian partnership emboldens both countries to take actions they might have avoided individually. Maybe China concludes that with Russian diplomatic and economic backing, they can force reunification with Taiwan despite American opposition. Maybe Russia decides that with Chinese support, they can redraw borders in Eastern Europe without facing the kind of isolation that would otherwise deter aggression. Maybe smaller powers aligned with Moscow and Beijing feel empowered to challenge American interests in their regions, calculating that they'll receive backup from this new axis. The risk of miscalculation in that environment is catastrophic. You've got nuclear-armed powers with coordinated strategies facing off against American forces and our allies, and any incident, any provocation, any miscommunication can escalate faster than diplomacy can contain it. If shooting starts between American and Chinese forces over Taiwan, does Russia exploit our distraction in Europe? If conflict erupts between NATO and Russia, does China make moves in Asia? And if we're fighting in multiple theaters simultaneously against coordinated adversaries, are we prepared for that? Have we resourced that? Have we thought through what victory even looks like when you're facing the combined weight of two nuclear powers with 6 billion people? I've seen moments where American policy pushed us toward the edge, where we came closer to major conflict than the public knew, where careful diplomacy and clear thinking pulled us back from catastrophe. This feels like one of those moments, except the margins for error are smaller because we're facing coordinated adversaries rather than isolated challenges. And the long-term trajectory is toward more confrontation rather than less because we've structured the competition that way through our own choices. So what do? Here's the honest truth. American citizens have to demand better strategic thinking from their government. We've got to remember that great power competition isn't about tough talk and tariffs and personal relationships between leaders. It's about understanding interests and incentives and second-order effects. It's about building coalitions rather than fracturing them. It's about thinking several moves ahead instead of reacting to whatever dominates this week's news cycle. We've got to insist that Congress fulfill its constitutional role in foreign policy. That means hearings on the strategic implications of major policy shifts before they happen, not after. That means demanding impact assessments when the president wants to impose tariffs or sanctions or withdraw from agreements. That means asking the hard questions. What are we trying to achieve? How does this policy get us there? What are the unintended consequences? What happens if it doesn't work? These aren't partisan questions. These are basic strategic competence questions that should unite anyone who cares about American security and prosperity, regardless of political affiliation. We've got to rebuild our alliances, and that means treating them like partnerships rather than protection rackets. It means consultation before decisions, not announcements that allies learn about from Twitter. It means burden-sharing conversations that respect the different circumstances and capabilities of different countries rather than one-size-fits-all demands for payment increases. It means demonstrating reliability over years and administrations so that when we say we'll stand with you, people believe it because we've proven it through consistent action. And we've got to stay engaged with this issue even when it feels abstract and distant. China and Russia forming an alliance sounds like something that happens over there, something that doesn't affect your daily life. But when that alliance succeeds in creating an alternative international system, when it pulls countries away from partnership with the United States, when it creates coordinated economic and military challenges that we're not structured to counter, it comes home. It shows up in your job security when American companies lose market access. It shows up in your cost of living when supply chains fragment and competition for resources intensifies. It shows up in your children's future when they enter a world where American influence has contracted and the international system is organized by principles hostile to democratic values and free markets. This is still our country. We've still got a say in how it relates to the world and what kind of international system we pass to the next generation. We've survived strategic mistakes before. After Vietnam, we rebuilt our credibility in our alliances. After the Cold War, we expanded democratic institutions and free markets to billions of people. After Iraq, we corrected course and refocused on threats that actually mattered. We can recover from this too, from the strategic incompetence that pushed China and Russia together when wiser policy would have kept them apart. But that recovery requires citizens who refuse to accept that decline is inevitable, who demand accountability from their representatives, who insist that we can compete effectively against any adversary if we're smart about it. I have to believe that America can get this right, that we can acknowledge the China-Russia partnership is a serious challenge without panicking, that we can develop competitive strategies that play to our advantages in technology and innovation and alliance networks, that we can rebuild trust with partners who question our reliability, that we can think strategically about how to create divisions between adversaries rather than driving them together. But that's going to require all of us to pay attention, to learn how great power competition actually works, to distinguish between foreign policy, theater, and serious strategy, and to hold our government accountable for decisions that will shape America's place in the world for generations to come. The choice is ours. Let's make sure we choose wisely, because the alternative is a world organized by Beijing and Moscow rather than Washington. And that's not a world that serves American interests or American values.